Hey everybody, this is James from TeaDB bringing you another Inbetweenisode. So I am filming this again from my parents' condo, so sorry about the lighting in the previous episode. I realized after looking at the footage that filming with the gorgeous lake that is right in the background is not a good idea because of natural light. So you'd think that I would know a little bit about filming, having done so many of these by then, but I'll be honest, I'm still a newbie and figuring things out. So today I am doing a episode on a blog post. So this is a sort of a unique episode, I guess, in that sense. And so I just wanted to talk about this one post that a lot of people have been looking at and discussing, and it's done by Marco. So those of you that are not familiar with his blog, you should definitely check it out. I think he's done a lot of just reviews of teas. He has very descriptive tasting notes, and I think he's a smart guy. He's doing a lot of he's been doing some very interesting storage experiments, and that's what this video is about. It's sort of a response, just sharing some of my thoughts about this post that Marco just did. So if you haven't seen it already, please go read it. There's a link in the description box below. It's on a storage experiment he did, and basically what he did was he conditioned his tea to sort of generate a consistent humidity. So I think it was 64 or 65 relative humidity, and then he basically controlled for temperature over the course of a year. And so he split a cake of Bosch, which is a white to tea 2016 production, in half, and he stored one of the cakes and keeping consistent humidity at 23 Celsius, which for those of us that are in the US is 73 Fahrenheit. So that was his approximation to room temperature. So some people's room temperature might be a little bit higher, others might be a little bit lower. Then he also stored the other half at 32 Celsius, which is 90 degrees Fahrenheit. So that is warm. That's really quite hot. And the idea of that temperature was to sort of approximate the hot end of Malaysia storage. So sorry, that's my parents' dog in the background. And basically, he was storing these cakes in mylars within something that was sort of conditioned to these parameters. And keeping in mind that humidity was not really high at all. So I picked up a dog in the meantime, my parents' dog again. So I'm going to just keep going with this. And so he basically controlled for that, and then he did this over the course of a year. And I think that's important. We'll come back to that later. And he basically found that there was a really big difference in how the teas performed. The 32, the tea in the hotter box basically had aged much quicker. I think the leaves had been darkened. There was a visual difference, and they tasted quite different. I believe that the 23C tea was a little bit sharper, a little bit less aged overall. And I think one of his big takeaways was that the difference between the teas was so stark. One of the other things that I appreciated about his post is he laid out what he was trying to do very clearly. He wanted something that wasn't super expensive, and he could basically set it and forget it for good chunks of the year. You can sort of read his individual criteria on the post. I think it was interesting for a number of reasons. And if we think about how storage is usually referred to, we're usually using, sometimes we'll use the location name. So Malaysia, we'll use dry or wet. Those are really commonly used. And I think it's important to know that I think for most people they'll hear those, and I think it implies more heavily about the humidity element rather than the temperature. And I think they're both quite important. And I think we're now starting to get into the phase where we're looking a lot more at temperature too. And I wouldn't be surprised if sort of the next part of storage in the West is looking at more controlling the temperature elements of this. So I thought it was interesting that this specific experiment was only really about temperature. And one of the things I've heard after seeing this post is, 90 F or 90 degrees Fahrenheit or 32 Celsius. That's really quite hot. That's really very hot for just about anywhere in the West. That's even quite hot for Malaysia. That is probably closer to the average high of the day than it is to the median temperature. And I think he chose this, and he actually mentioned that he has, I'm not sure if this box is active yet, but he's trying to do a box even higher at 40 Celsius. And the idea is, I guess, that microbials are just much, much more active at higher temperatures. It's really correlated with temperature. And so one of the concerns I've heard is about mold. And I guess that's understandable because those are extreme parameters. And if you have played around with the dew point calculator, which I do recommend you do if you haven't and you're storing pu'erh, and as Marco notes, that the risk areas are really not very high. There's really very low risk if you're storing tea right around 64, 65, 66 RH. And that risk rises significantly if you move that relative humidity up to the 70s. So if you get it to 70, there's some risk. If you get it to 75, the risk gets higher. And if you move it to 80, the risk is very, very high. And I think it's important to note that you don't just store tea at 75 and it would grow overnight. It could be a matter of a few days or longer, a month, a few months even. So I think that's important to keep in mind. And so when I look at this experiment, I don't think it's a huge mold risk at all. In fact, I think that's one of the more interesting things about it is that it really falls very cleanly into a safe zone area for the dew point calculator. And so for people that are more looking at pumping up their humidity with bovitas or whatever and trying to store, I've heard of people even trying to store their tea at 80 RH. Things like that really are cause for concern. I think it's fine if your tea edges up to 70 or 75 RH now and then, but if you're storing it consistently at those temperatures or at that humidity, I'm less certain of the sort of long-term stability of the teas in those cases. And I think the other thing, and I don't think Marco overstepped his bounds here, is that it's important to note that this is a very short time frame, and this is just one tea, and it's a Western boutique tea, which is a rather specific sort of tea that he tested this on. I would guess that for something like a Monghai 74542, the results would be just as promising, if not more so. That being said, it wasn't for that, and it's, I think more importantly, it's just for a year. What this storage will do to a tea for 5 years or 10 years, I don't know. It would probably you'd have to try it and see. But it's you could speculate that maybe it would be closer to Malaysian storage where it falls. I don't know because we are actually holding it very consistently at a certain temperature under these parameters. The other thing I did like about Marco's post too is that I think it's a pretty practical setup, honestly, and that was one of his parameters for sort of setting this up. Is something that doesn't have all the bells and whistles and costs like $1,000 to set up. I think he said that this costs something like 50 USD to set up, and I think it's a very plausible way to store. And for me, if I were to adopt a method like this, which I haven't decided yet, I would probably not be storing my tea all the way at 32C. just because I would be a little more cautious, and I think, I don't know, I think it's fine to try and experiment on something like this, but we really don't know how it's going to turn out in the long term. And I think so far the results are promising, but it's important to not take it too out of context, in my opinion at least. And for me, I wouldn't quite be comfortable storing all my teas at 32 Celsius. If I were to set up a similar setup, I'd probably go for, I don't know, split the difference somewhere between 23 and 32. And that's just because maybe I'm inherently a little more cautious, but when you're talking about a lot of tea and a lot of very expensive tea, I think we probably all should lean a little bit towards that cautious end. But I not to take anything away at all from the experiment. And I think probably the most important thing to take away from the experiment is that temperature really does matter, and that might be a more practical way for Westerners to sort of control their storage and speed. And I think Marco's setup is safe. I think that's important. And I think as he continues to do experiments with an even hotter box, and as the experiments sort of play out for longer periods of time, I think it's going to be really interesting to see how it goes. I'd also be curious to know if Marco ends up storing all of his teas at this temperature. It's important to note that this is an experiment. It wasn't necessarily like he had put his whole stash into these sorts of stores. So I'm curious if he has the confidence in this to sort of go through it with all of the teas that he has. So yeah, those are my thoughts. Please do check out that post. I think it's a very interesting one. I think it's really one of the most promising storage experiments that we've seen, with some real implications, practical implications for how we can store tea. Those are my thoughts. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Let me know how you like this Inbetweenisode. Probably a little bit nerdy for those that aren't too into pu'erh, but please do give it a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and I will see you all next time. Cheers.